Well, the time is just gone 19 minutes to 5 p.m. This afternoon on the Iftar Drive right here on Salah Media. And we are now reflecting, looking 20 years ago when the United States of America invaded Iraq. And 20 years later, what the situation is. And we're speaking with a former U.S. Marine, Ross Caputi, and he has served from 2003 2006 as a former U.S. Marine and also participated in the second siege of Fallujah. Now, Ross and I have a bit of a history together where we have done some extensive coverage and interviews, both looking at Ross, as a Marine, but also in terms of after, in fact, after the U.S. Withdrawal from Iraq at that point in time. And Ross has then written extensively, and 20 years later, going back, reflecting. Ross, good afternoon to you. I think it's morning in your time in America, but I must say it's just wonderful connecting with you again after all these years.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back.
Yes, Ross, and I know you've written extensively, and you and I have had some detailed discussions, both looking at your experiences, but just looking at the situation now, 20 years down the line, and time has really flown very, very quickly. Just some of your thoughts, your reflections. What have you been doing with yourself? Since obviously being a U.S. Marine, having been to Iraq, and then 20 years later, you look back and say, uh, this is where I was, and what have I done? What have I achieved?
Yeah, so I think the last time we spoke, there was still a large American troop presence in Iraq, and I was part of a number of different efforts campaigning to try to get U.S. forces out of Iraq, and also campaigning for reparations because my position has always been we illegally invaded this country, we destroyed the country in the process of the occupation. So I've argued that we owe Iraq reparations. But this is while it was an ongoing conflict, and now there is still a small U.S. troop presence in Iraq. It's mostly advisors and things of that sort. There's really no combat troops still on the ground in Iraq. In the American public has largely forgotten about Iraq entirely. It's no longer a topic of interest within the media. It's very difficult to continue to try to keep public attention on Iraq and to campaign for things like reparations or even humanitarian aid, because there's still a need within Iraq for humanitarian aid. So now my work in recent years, excuse me, has been working as a historian, trying to create educational materials for either high school or college classrooms, trying to correct the American memory of our invasion and occupation. Because what became very clear over the last few weeks after the 20th anniversary of our invasion on March 19th, there's been a lot of retrospective looks back on Iraq, talking about what the war has meant to American society. And it's very clear that we learned all of the wrong lessons. And there's a lot of talk about Iraq being a mistake. And I think it's really remarkable that as Americans, we can look back on Iraq as just being a mistake. It's kind of incredible because this sort of reframing, for one, completely elides the fact that we illegally invaded the country. And two, just sort of boils down our decision to go to war with a country that posed no threat to us at all as sort of a cost-benefit analysis. Only a year later did we decide that this would cost much more than we were willing to spend in order to completely restructure Iraqi society and turn it into an American ally. Nowhere else in the world is this a normal thing that you can make a decision to go to war based on a cost-benefit analysis. Either a war is a necessary war or it's an unjust war by normal standards, by the tradition of the just war doctrine or international humanitarian law. So I've been doing this work as a historian to sort of correct our memory of this conflict, to continue to try to raise awareness about what we did to Iraq. It's an uphill battle, but myself and my colleagues, we're still fighting this fight.
Well, you certainly are, but I see, personally, obviously, this has been a blessing in disguise for you as well, because I see you are a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts as well. So, from an academic perspective, it worked very well for you, Ross, and looking back, and if you stayed with the U.S. Marine Corps, had you not taken that decision at that point in time, would you have been where you are right now?
That's a really good question. And I have to admit, I don't think I would be where I am right now in my life had I not participated in this. And I try to think carefully and responsibly about that, because for me to have this personal and professional growth that I've had as a result of this really terrible experience, I participated in a lot of violence to get to where I am. So I try to make good on my responsibility to Iraqis using this, position that I now have as a doctoral candidate to do historical work that can actually benefit Iraqis and to continue to raise awareness about, what this occupation has meant for them. Lately, myself and a few colleagues, we've started an organization called Archive Iraq, and we mean to turn this into an open source, open access, digital archive of historical documents on the occupation. And we want to create, materials for high school classrooms and college classrooms to use our positions as academics as a kind of public service. Not only to benefit Iraqi society, but to benefit our society too. Because if we continue to live with this mythology we've created about how we liberated Iraq, it's just going to lead us into more disastrous foreign policy decisions.
Exactly. And I think this is exactly the point. And I'm just looking at one of the articles that have been written, Ross, and talking about the US propaganda, and how they have actually won Iraq's battle space. And even, we're talking about Iraq, but also I think there are similarities with Vietnam as well in the aftermath of the war that had taken place in Vietnam. But again, it's about lessons, and have Americans actually learned their lessons?
That's a great question. They've learned some lessons. I don't think they're the lessons that I hoped that our society would learn. In some ways, the lessons they've learned are how to wage war better, and that's really concerning to me. They've also gotten much better at propaganda, and I think that's one of the biggest difference between the invasion and occupation of Iraq and our war in Vietnam, where it was really the critical media in Vietnam that turned the American public against the war. The United States military learned their lesson from that war and then developed these new tactics and these strategies to turn the media into a tool to disseminate their propaganda to the American public. So propaganda became a really essential military tool during the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Excuse me. And that's partly why we have such a distorted memory of this conflict in the US, because most of what we remember is just propaganda. The stories that were told to us about, Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, the stories about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi leading al-Qaeda in Iraq, all of this was a very distorted version of the truth, intentionally distorted to deceive the American public into supporting this war and keeping us in Iraq for years.
Yes, and just talking about Saddam Hussein, and you're talking about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi as well, and also looking at Fallujah, because I think for you, I think the defining moment was Fallujah, Ross.
It was, yeah, it was a big wake-up call for me. I was having doubts about what we were doing in Iraq. I didn't have access to any more information than an ordinary American while I was in Iraq. We had, Fox News playing on the chow hall on our bases in Iraq. And that's really the only source I had of information. But the limited interactions that I had with Iraqis, I could see that this conflict to them meant something much more complicated than what was being told to me about the reasons why we were there. And then when we got to Fallujah, the story no longer made sense. I just couldn't, the story that we were actually liberating Fallujah, even though I was watching us destroy half of the city, and I mean literally half of the city, just like leveled to the ground. There's no way a critical thinker can see that and still believe that we're actually liberating the people who live in the city. For me, it was a big wake-up call, and to this day, I feel a strong sense of responsibility for what I participated in, and Fallujah remains a big focus in my own academic research. I'm still trying to tell this story always better, always with more historical documentation, and to try to work towards accountability. I don't know if that's something we'll ever achieve, but it's a goal we're working towards.
Well, and also, I think 20 years later, looking at what has happened to the people of Iraq, what has happened to the millions of refugees who have been displaced after, 20 years later. And I'm sure that the horrors of this war, the legacy, looking at the lives that were lost, and this is still haunting many, many Iraqis. And at this point in time, nothing is being said, not much is being written about the plight of these people who have lost basically everything in their lives, Rose.
Yeah, it's incredibly tragic, and in my own country, there's very little awareness about it. There's a lot of media discussion about the costs veterans have paid for being part of this conflict, the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, the difficulties veterans have had readjusting to civilian life. But the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in Iraq are incomparably higher. I don't want to say all, but like the majority of Iraqis have witnessed and experienced traumatic events and still carry those psychological wounds with them. The country, if you go to large city centers, there's been some reconstruction, and you might even find fancy new shopping malls and things like that. But if you go to smaller, poorer villages or neighborhoods like around Baghdad, there's still a tremendous amount of destruction from the war, and most people just have to live with that. Their institutions, hospitals, schools are still struggling to rebuild. Services like electricity are intermittent. It's a society that is still very much recovering, and most likely will continue to be recovering for at least a decade after this.
Rose, have you been back to Iraq after?
I haven't. I as much as I would like to go, I'm concerned that I would endanger people around me for me being who I am and having, been a former U.S. Marine. I would very much like to go, but I'm just, concerned about making others around me a target.
Well, definitely, it does make sense what you're saying. But also, I think, I suppose, in your own way, you are doing a lot in terms of interaction with people of Iraqi origin and with the work that you are doing. So, I suppose, there's a lot that you are doing at this point in time to make sure that, Iraqis actually just feel comfortable having you around, and more importantly, appreciate the work that you are doing right now.
Yeah, we have our organization, Archive Iraq. We have partners that we work with in Iraq, and our efforts are about empowering them to do this kind of historical work that we're doing. So we're beginning to do oral histories. We recently held an international academic conference with the University of Mosul. So we have partners in Iraq, and here we're just kind of focused on supporting them and trying to build this bridge of solidarity and academic collaboration between our two countries.
Well, that's brilliant, and I'm sure they do appreciate all of it, Ross. Ross, just obviously looking ahead, and I know that you are focusing a lot, but just in terms of America, the United States, looking at the mainstream media, are you able to connect with mainstream media in terms of what you are doing? And secondly, also for mainstream media to truly appreciate people like yourselves, or is this, embedded media, or are we looking at a media that has already been captured and still at this point in time pushing the agenda or the narrative that the government wants the media to push?
It's something I've always struggled with, and I don't want to just excuse my own shortcomings and just say the media has been ignoring me. You know, I'm sure if Iraqis deserve somebody more capable than myself to be doing this kind of work. Maybe somebody more articulate, maybe a better writer, and maybe somebody else might have had better success in breaking through this wall to be able to speak to the mainstream media. However, over the last few weeks, after the 20th anniversary, I've been watching the retrospective talks and articles about Iraq, especially the ones being published by the New York Times, to a lesser extent, the Washington Post. They've been really bad. It's just sort of a lot of the same myths, a lot of the same propaganda that was, you know, being thrown around very casually in 2003 to 2008, just got pulled out again for the 20th anniversary. So we really haven't learned much at all, and it's very disappointing. And the media coverage remains very poor, very sort of narrow in focus, sort of limited to the American experience of this conflict. And to the extent that they bring Iraqi voices into the debate, it's usually to reaffirm an American perspective. So Iraqis are very rarely given the space to just tell the stories that they want to tell on their own terms. They're usually given a more circumscribed space for which to tell their stories. So this is also something we have to work on. And I think part of the problem is the American public isn't aware enough to even demand better media coverage of Iraq. They don't know just how bad the media coverage is in order to want something better, right? So at a baseline, we have to begin with an education campaign, I think, to begin talking about media reform and things like that. But at this, again, I think the bigger problem is I want to return back to the question of propaganda, because so much of these very poor, very partial media narratives have been shaped by this American propaganda apparatus. And to me, I think that's really the heart of the problem.
Well, certainly is. And just finally, Ross, very, very different because from 9/11, because, when one looks at how a 9/11 is commemorated, the anniversaries of 9/11 over the years compared to the anniversary of this war, it's chalk and cheese, very, very different.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And to some extent, that's to be expected, right? I mean, most societies are, they feel a greater connection to their own victims, right? But I think that's something that needs to change. We need to grow. Our culture needs to grow. We need to increase our capacity for humanitarianism and our sympathy for other peoples and other parts of the world.
Well, Ross, thank you very much for that and for your time with us this afternoon right here on Salam Media. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, it's been an absolute pleasure connecting with you once again. And hopefully at some point in time, you and I will be having a lot more discussions going forward.
Yeah, I'd
but
love
for now,
to.
please take care. We
Thank
wish
you.
you all the
Always
best.
happy
Please
to do
take
it.
care. Thank you. Ross Caputi was us this afternoon right here on Salam Media, and wonderful being in touch with him once again. And just to remind you, he is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts as well, and a former U.S. Marine who was in Iraq. And that brings us straight on to 5 p.m. We're going to go for a break, and when we come back, we will be joined by Fatima Asmal, and we are continuing with the series that we had started last week with Fatima Asmal, looking at the month of Ramadan, looking at various aspects